When I met Michael, I was in my junior year of high school. We met on a blind date. He was about 3 years older than me. I told him I was a gymnast, and he wanted to see something. And of course, I go doing a bunch of backflips down the yard. And he was just enamored at that point. And he called me the next day. And then I think we talked every day for a week or so, and then just decided to take it to the next step. I was attracted to his charm. Not very many men would carry your purse at the mall, but he was one of those guys who did that. And at that time in my life, that was what I wanted. He was very smart, very, very smart. He loved working on cars. I can't remember a time that his hands were ever clean. At one point, he was going to work for his dad in the construction field.
Working side by side was pretty awesome. He got to see another side of me outside of the home. My son was still pretty young, in his early 20s, and just trying to find his way, trying to really search to see what path he wanted. I don't think he had anything really zeroed down yet.
Michael could tell his dad anything, and I was envious of that because I didn't come from that kind of a family.
The environment I try to create is just to try to be always open. There's no secrets. There's problems. We all work together to solve it.
Michael's dad accepted me like I was one of their own. At one point, Michael's dad got a wood stove, so he taught me how to chop firewood. That was fun. And I think that's where Mike got that protective aspect from his dad, because his dad would make sure the family was taken care of no matter what. Michael wanted to be my knight in shining armor. He wanted to fix everything that was wrong in my life.
After dating 4 years, Michael and Margaret move in with Margaret's grandmother.
My grandmother was diabetic, and she had onset dementia, so we moved in to care for her. Michael and I had the basement. We were pretty reclusive. We would just hang out inside, watch movies, cuddle up on the couch, talk about life, the things we wanted out of life.
Michael and Margaret return home after celebrating Mrs. Temple's birthday. They're surprised to find their friend Kelly waiting for them.
Kelly needed to use our computer to get a money transfer. So we walk inside to my bedroom so then Kelly could use our computer for a little bit.
The three head for the basement, careful not to disturb anyone. Margaret's grandmother is asleep upstairs, and her visiting uncle is in the living room watching TV.
A couple seconds later, we hear a knock at the door. So Michael opened the door, and the first thing we saw was a pistol coming through a small crack in the door.
2 armed and masked men burst into the couple's bedroom.
We were in shock. The 2 guys took Michael over to the safe and asked him to open it. He said no. So then they threatened me. He still said no. And then fight or flight just kicked in, and I started fighting the guy who was in front of me. He started hitting me in the head with the butt of the gun, and I saw stars. I was just doing my best to stay conscious and fight for my life. As I'm fighting, I hear what sounds like 2 pots being hit together.
What Margaret hears isn't pots and pans, it's gunfire.
The guy that was fighting me ran off, so I went over to check on Michael, and he was down on the floor by the back door. He had a hole in his chest and in his thigh, just leaking blood.
The man who just shot Michael now aims at his next target.
I vividly remember him raising the gun. I feel like I can still see it in slow motion of him lifting up the gun. It felt like he had it right to my forehead. And I remember looking past it to him, and he was wearing all black. The only thing that I remember seeing was these bright eyes in like a sea of black. And I just closed my eyes thinking I was dead. When I opened my eyes, both of them were gone. Michael was on the floor with pooled blood. He was coughing, he could barely talk. But he told me that he stabbed the guy. He just kept saying that over and over before he lost consciousness.
Kelly runs upstairs and calls 911.
I got a phone call from home from my supervision who advised that there had been a home invasion, a robbery gone bad. Suspect had shot Michael twice, and he had to be taken up to our shock trauma with life-threatening injuries.
The police took him and I both to shock trauma. I had a huge gash over my eye. And the police tried to question me, but I didn't want to answer their questions until I knew Michael was okay. And they wouldn't answer me.
I'm communicating with the doctors and the nurses. We could never really get a clear answer, see if our son's gonna live or die.
You feel like your world is shattered. And all the control you thought you had is just gone.
As Michael Temple Jr. fights for his life, police rush Margaret's grandmother and injured uncle to safety and try to bring order to a chaotic scene.
It was snowy then, and folks were in their houses. They heard it. People were genuinely concerned about what happened at that home. They didn't necessarily know the particulars or Michael Jr. specifically, but when this initially happened, there was panic in that neighborhood.
Once we got Michael out of there, we searched the area. It was snowing heavily, so we're looking for footprints or any type of other evidence. The first thing I remember noticing was blood near a light pole.
After Michael was shot in the leg, he pulled out a knife that he had in his pocket and he stabbed the suspect, who then shot him in the chest.
We began to follow that trail that went out from the basement up into the front yard to that light pole, and then it stopped. So we believed that would be where whoever was stabbed got into a vehicle and left the area.
A neighbor tells police he heard the gunshots and moments later saw a silver truck speed away.
We immediately contacted hospitals in the area in the hopes that maybe he went there to seek medical treatment, but we learned that no one had come in at any of the medical locations in our area.
Detective DiPietro examines the crime scene, hoping it will speak for itself.
If you were to go to the house for the first time, you would obviously go to the front door, but these individuals went to the side door.
We figured it was someone that knew the victim because they knew exactly where to go to.
We recovered 357 SIG cartridge casings in the kitchen area, and we located the knife that Michael used to stab the suspect underneath the dresser area. I remember as I went down to the bottom of the stairs and I looked to the right into this bedroom, I remember seeing a safe in the closet. Right away I thought, if there's a safe involved, is that what these guys were looking for?
When the police pulled me in for questioning, they wanted the safe combination. I wanted to be helpful to catch the people that did this, but I also didn't want charges put on me.
Margaret's desire to find justice for Michael wins out, and she gives up the combination. Police find a stash of opioid pills inside.
We were talking about drug involvement now, so it increased our suspect pool by a lot.
Since we only allowed certain people to come to the house, I gave the police every person who had access to the house.
One of those people is Margaret's friend Kelly, who was waiting for Michael and Margaret when they got home.
Kelly told detectives that she just happened to be at the house when they came home, and she went inside with them, and then all of a sudden these two home invasion robbers come in, and she was not hurt or touched during the assault. The other two were assaulted and beat up and shot at and injured, so it was very suspicious.
Kelly insists she was only at the house to use Michael's computer.
We had that computer analyzed to check to see exactly what she was doing. And we did verify that, in fact, she was doing a wire transfer paperwork. We spent quite a bit of time looking into Margaret's friend, and every bit of investigation we did never linked her to the crime, actually excluded her in some instances as having any knowledge or involvement in it.
We played music for Michael and tried to talk to him, which was what I did while he was unconscious. Once he was able to at least talk through writing. I had this little spiral notebook that we talked all day, back and forth, just writing to each other, asking each other, if we were okay.
With Michael now conscious, Detective DiPietro pays him a visit.
But Michael didn't really provide any suspect information. He just didn't know.
Michael tells police that the list of people who know about the safe is a short one. He says he's a small-time dealer who only sells to people he knows well.
I told him that, with the amount of people he has come into his house, that eventually someone's going to come in to rob him, and he's going to get shot. Mike got involved with drugs in high school. He was very bored with school, and Mike has a very addictive personality. And prescription drugs were easy enough to get in our area. Mike and I could have gotten our hands on just about anything we wanted.
Every addict tells themselves that pills are safer, that you're not really an addict because it's something that's prescribed. But in my case, I knew what I was doing. We had some codependencies, and we fed each other's addiction, just like many couples who are fighting that battle. We wanted kids. Unfortunately, I was told that I can't have kids. The medication to fix the problem was going to be a couple $1,000s a month, and we couldn't afford that. So we started thinking of ways that we could make that happen. So Michael, when he brought to my attention that there's a way to make a lot of money, I was weary at first, but we decided to try, and it started going pretty well. He didn't want me close to that part of it. I was just mostly around for the ride. My idea was, let's just, do it until we have enough to pay for the fertility doctor, and we'll stop there. And then, a couple weeks later, his pride kind of got the better of him. Once we got to the amount that we needed, he actually invested it to flip it again. We were in the process of getting all that back when the shooting happened.
I think all of us shouldn't be shamed or put down for doing something egregious or illegal or nefarious, because no one is perfect. Not to say that, Michael Jr. should have been doing what he was doing, but at the same time, this was something that resulted in a lot of heartache and a lot of pain for a family, and, they are certainly innocent.
Michael survives and improves enough to leave the hospital, but in a wheelchair.
We put an addition onto the house. I had a living room and bathroom that would accommodate a wheelchair. Outside elevator that would be able to lift him up and down to get him into the house. Most positive sign, it's just his will to survive. Because most people, and including myself, I would have just rolled over because of the condition he was in was just unimaginable. But seeing what your child is going through, it was very stressful and strained.
Those first couple months were very hard, very emotional. We just racked our brain of who could do this. If not a friend, then who? Everybody that I looked at, I started wondering, is it this guy? Is it this person? Who would possibly do this?
As Michael Temple Jr. faces a long and uncertain road to recovery, detectives develop a new lead as to who may have targeted his safe.
When this occurred, we were experiencing a higher amount than normal of home invasion robberies. A gang called DMI, Dead Men's Incorporated, were suspected of being involved. They possibly owed Michael money. Michael might have owed them money, and they may have known where he kept his money and drugs. So once we learned of a possible gang involvement, the department immediately formed a task force to investigate all these cases and tried to figure out who had done this to Michael.
An anonymous tip points detectives to one particular member of Dead Men's Inc.
We located him walking down a street one day. He was cooperative, and he agreed to give us his DNA, and he also agreed to take his shirt off for investigators to show he had not been stabbed. We submitted his DNA to our lab, and we later learned that he was not the person that we were looking for.
With no more suspects, the case of the brutal home invasion that left a young man paralyzed freezes in the dead of winter.
It got very frustrating for us because we had gone down a bunch of rabbit holes trying to find out who did this, and every hole we went down, we were just hitting a brick wall.
Though the shooters are in the wind, police do make one arrest. Margaret. They charge her with felony possession of drugs with intent to distribute.
My mind was complete chaos. I felt like I betrayed my family and Michael's family. I just was lost. I didn't have any direction. I had no hope. I had no future. I didn't know what else to do other than to turn myself in and just see where it took me.
Margaret avoids further hardship when a judge only sentences her to probation. Michael is spared charges, but his fading health puts a strain on the young couple's relationship.
He was losing touch with his inner strength. His body would have these little seizures, and I think each time there was a complication, he just lost a little bit more hope. He had a light about him that just made me want to be around him all the time. But he just started losing touch with me. A year into caring for Michael, he saw the emotional toll that it was taking. One day, he just came to me and told me that I have to go. I have to go and find my own path. So I think Michael saw the struggle that I was having. I just wasn't healthy. And I think we both sort of needed to break away.
As the years pass, it becomes clear that Michael isn't getting any better.
It just was a downward trend the whole time. It was hard to watch because you knew that a part of him was suffering. I got a call from Mike's father telling me that he had tried to call Mike and couldn't get a hold of him. And he came home to find Michael on the floor. Mr. Mike wasn't sure Mike was going to make the ambulance ride to the hospital. I left immediately, went to the hospital, and by the time I got there, Mike was gone.
The infections and blood clots from wounds that never truly healed had become too much for Michael.
It wasn't until a few weeks later that I contacted his friend Chris. And Chris told me that they already had the funeral and that I wasn't allowed to go. So I didn't get to say goodbye. I think his dad felt very betrayed. He let me in. He treated me like his own family, and I think Mr. Mike felt like I walked away. I think he wanted me to do better and be better, and I couldn't do that. I couldn't emotionally do that or be that at that time.
Michael's death, 5 years after the home invasion that destroyed his life, heats up this cold case.
After Michael had passed away, the detectives called me and said that the entire course of their investigation was shifting from assault with a deadly weapon to murder. And with it being a murder case and a cold case, that it was going to pick up more momentum moving forward.
Because Michael Jr. didn't die initially, I think the case lost a lot of its steam until the autopsy revealed that the cause of his death were injuries sustained from that home invasion. That is what turned this from an assault to a murder investigation. And I think that is what changed the tempo in trying to get the word out about solving this case.
When you're given a cold case, the first thing you do is look at the original case file to see if there is anything that could have possibly been overlooked.
Detectives Collier and DiPietro take a fresh look at everything, starting with the original crime scene.
Michael's down on the ground over there, and I see the guy crouched down, the little guy with the bandana with the gun.
Okay.
He's got his gun to Mike's temple.
So when you guys came in through this way, obviously the bad guys, you would have noticed if someone would have followed you right in, right? So where do you believe these guys were? Do you think they were in with your uncle? Or do you think they came in through this other door at the top of the stairs?
No, I think they were in here with my uncle, because even if the blinds were up that way, I would have saw a shadow or somebody walk past the front of the house. So
would you have heard them if they came in through this door?
Yes. Yeah, because it's right next to our room.
investigators try once again to run DNA found at the crime scene. They don't get a hit, but it isn't a lost cause yet.
Our evidence coordinator, Craig Robinson, had read an article about a company saying they're doing some cutting-edge stuff with DNA analysis. We can basically take an unknown profile and phenotype it so they can give you what most likely the person would look like.
To create this portrait of a killer, genealogists use blood left on the knife that Michael used to stab his attacker.
When they generate the snapshot, they can tell you what eye color somebody has, what their hair color is, where their origin is from. The night that the home invasion robbery occurred, the suspects were wearing a bandana and face mask. So we really didn't have too much to go on. But Margaret stated that she did see the person's eyes.
I couldn't recognize his face, but he did have the bluish eyes.
We never told the company that. So once I saw the sketch, I felt these guys are obviously legit.
Anne Arundel County investigators released the computer-generated snapshot of Michael's killer.
When we put that composite out, I was very excited about it. I thought somebody's going to recognize him. I couldn't fathom that somebody would have kept their mouth shut for this many years and not shared with anyone else that they had done this. Somebody's going to recognize this person and relate it back to a story they might have heard.
But it didn't go anywhere. It didn't take us to any suspects, and that brick wall makes another appearance, and we smacked right into it.
Police in Anne Arundel County were stumped.
Authorities say it was 2 clues that they were able. So I was first introduced to the Temple investigation relatively late. I was the cold case reporter, that who would build relationships with detectives within police departments. And the homicide detective and the cold case detective sat me down and said, hey, listen, we think we might be able to solve a cold case.
We needed to get out into the public. So the community knows that this case, we did not just forget about it. We did not just stop working on it.
I was like, okay, here we go. I was introduced to Michael Temple Sr. It was at the cemetery where his son and wife are buried. I remember it being an extremely snowy day. He was someone who was on the brink of giving up hope, but also holding out a sliver that something might change.
Standing at the foot of his son's grave, the typically reserved father makes a desperate plea to the public.
Snitching is a word invented by cowards. What I'm asking for is help and justice, which is for the strong to stand up for what's right. And any help that we could get would be greatly appreciated.
A father's plea for justice on the local news brings Michael Temple Jr.'s case back into the mind of the public, but nothing else. The appeal doesn't yield a single new lead.
It took the wind out of my sails at that point. You just can't fathom that somebody hasn't come forward. But we didn't give up.
Detective Collier holds out hope that genealogists might get a result from a radical new investigative tool they've been developing. It's called reverse genetic genealogy.
When you are doing investigative genetic genealogy, instead of going backward in time, now you've got to come forward in time. My job is to identify those common ancestors and then identify all of their descendants and narrow it down to a very small pool of potential persons of interest, oftentimes only one.
Genealogists again turn to the blood on the knife Michael used to stab his attacker. They want to use the DNA from that blood to build a family tree that could include the killer.
We were able to find different connections that all zeroed in on one family tree. And that set of parents only had one son.
We were kind of shocked. So we pulled up a picture of this guy and wow, look at his eyes. This could be our guy. This could be our killer.
His name is Fred Frampton Jr., and he looked like the snapshot generated for the DNA profile 3 years earlier.
He lived in the area. He was the right age. And he did have prior police contact up until 2010. From 2010 on, this person had no more police contacts.
With no prior felony convictions, Frampton's DNA never made it into CODIS.
And we learned, still to that day, he had a silver truck registered to him, which, again, a neighbor said they saw a silver truck fleeing the scene.
Then we ran to see if he owned any guns, and he owned a .357, which is the same caliber of the shell casings that we found next to Michael Temple that night. It all started to click.
Investigators believe Frampton is their bright-eyed killer, but they are still a long way from proving it. They will need a sample of Frampton's DNA to match what they found on the bloody knife. A team follows Frampton day and night, looking for the right time to secretly snatch anything that might have his DNA on it.
We observed Fred Frampton and his other coworkers go to lunch, and he was walking into a 7-Eleven smoking a cigarette. He actually flicked the cigarette right at the detective's car. So we waited for him to go inside and we grabbed a cigarette. I just couldn't believe that it just happened so easily.
Lo and behold, it was a DNA match. We couldn't believe it.
It was a great feeling. It felt like Christmas.
Police arrest Fred Frampton Jr.
He kept asking, what's this about? And he's like, I'm under arrest. I was like, yes, you're under arrest. And I told him, let's talk about what happened on Williamsburg Lane. At first, he said he didn't recall ever being on Williamsburg Lane. We have your DNA. We know you were there.
He looked at us and he's like, how did you get my DNA? And I remember telling him, you got to watch where you throw your cigarette butts.
Once he discovered that we had his DNA, his whole demeanor did change because he knew that it was over.
And from there, he confessed to everything. He said Michael Temple pulled out a knife and stabbed him. And he goes, once he stabbed me, then he goes, I shot him.
Frampton admits he's the killer, but claims the home invasion wasn't his idea.
He admitted that it was his friend Jonathan Ludwig's idea, and he was the one that he did the home invasion with. Jonathan Ludwig was a client of Margaret and Michael Temple. So it was a targeted home invasion. He stated that at that time, him and Jonathan were inseparable. Jonathan Ludwig knew exactly where the safe was, knew that they should have drugs and money in the safe.
Unlike Frampton, Ludwig will never see the inside of a courtroom. He died of a drug overdose 7 months earlier. In the years following the murder, Margaret Ridgely had picked up the pieces and moved on. She had a son and was settling into a new home when police called.
It was the detective, and She told me that they got a hit on the DNA and they finally know who it was that shot Mike. And in that moment, I lost all my breath. I hit my knees and I just started to cry. Finally getting answers was the most freeing moment that I've had.
There's one more person investigators have to tell about this break in the case. Michael's father.
The most shocking part was knowing that the murderer was actually working with Mr. Mike after the incident for a number of years. I can't imagine the feeling, knowing that he could have looked his son's killer in the eye every day.
We brought Mr. Temple into the Criminal Investigation Division and we sat him down and we told him the name of the two suspects. Mr. Temple was visibly upset. He actually trained Fred Frampton and Jonathan Ludwig on his construction site.
Michael Sr., he's a guy who, when you shake his hand, you feel the calluses of the hard work that he puts in. He also wants the people around him to do well. And so when you have these folks that are working with him on a construction site, he's taking them under his wing. And the deceit that he felt.
So keep your friends close and your enemies closer. You can't get no closer.
You can see how he was seething. You can see the sheer frustration, the anger, my goodness, you've been here right next to me this entire time under my nose.
When they first told me, you just stop, and trying to gather yourself. I hear this was people that worked right beside me. Somebody to do that, be that cold and calculating and just be right next to you the whole time and can see your pain and it's just unfathomable. It's just against all human nature.
Prosecutor Samantha Mildenberg offers Frampton a choice: plead guilty and face 55 years in prison with the possibility of parole, or go to trial and risk life without parole. Frampton's lawyer asks for mercy, claiming his client is a changed man.
Mr. Frampton's argument for leniency was he stayed out of trouble. He had turned his life around. He had kicked his habit, and he was working and raising his son. Personally, anyone can see that this individual made a huge mistake. The other side of me saw that another individual was murdered because of his brazen acts of going into a home late at night, armed with a gun, to steal money. He wanted what he wanted and he did what he did. And there are repercussions to everybody's actions. Ultimately, he went ahead and took a plea.
At his sentencing hearing, Frampton
To do.
Whatever Michael Jr. was doing with those guys all those years ago, it didn't need to be this. It didn't need to be death and jail and deceit and grieving relatives for a decade. It didn't need to be any of this.
I'd like my son to be remembered having a good heart, fun, maybe adventurous. not the perfect child, but definitely one that enjoyed life and respected others. Loved his family.
If I could talk to Michael's family, I would say that I'm sorry. That I couldn't save him. And that I never stopped loving them. And I really hope they're happy. Or as happy as they can be.
On the morning of June 13th, 1980, Wiley, Texas, looked exactly as it had on countless summer mornings before. The streets were quiet. Families were settling into ordinary routines. Children were preparing for church activities and the long days of early summer. Nothing about that Friday suggested it would become one of the darkest days in the town's history, or that its name would one day be remembered far beyond the borders of Texas. Wiley was the kind of community where familiarity was part of everyday life. Neighbors recognized one another. Families gathered through church, shared celebrations, and watched their children grow together. Trust was not simply expected. It formed the foundation of the community itself. When people opened their front doors, they usually knew the person standing outside. It was within that atmosphere of ordinary suburban life that two women came to know each other. They attended the same church. They participated in the same activities. They raised families in the same neighborhood. To those around them, they appeared to be friends connected by common values and a shared community. One of them would not survive the day. The other would later admit that she had caused her friend's death. Yet what followed would prove almost as shocking as the killing itself. The woman who acknowledged striking the fatal blows would ultimately walk free after a jury concluded that prosecutors had failed to prove she had committed murder beyond a reasonable doubt. Even decades later, the verdict continues to divide opinion. Some believe justice followed the law. Others believe justice was never achieved. Between those two opposing views lies a case that has become one of the most controversial homicide trials in the history of Texas. The death of Betty Gore is remembered not only because of its tragic outcome, but because nearly every aspect of the case forces difficult questions. How well can people truly know those closest to them? How does betrayal reshape ordinary relationships? Where is the legal boundary between defending oneself and using excessive force? And perhaps most importantly, how can investigators or jurors determine exactly what happened inside a room when only one person survives to tell the story? Those questions remain impossible to answer with complete certainty. Unlike many criminal cases, there were no eyewitnesses to the confrontation itself. No recording captured the final conversation. No independent witness could describe the argument as it unfolded. When the violence ended, only one voice remained capable of explaining what had happened inside the Gore family home. That reality shaped every stage of the investigation. It influenced the questions detectives asked. It defined the evidence presented at trial. It ultimately affected the verdict delivered by the jury. Because one participant died during the confrontation, many of the most critical moments can never be reconstructed with complete certainty. Some facts are firmly documented through physical evidence, witness testimony, and court records. Others exist only through the account given by the sole surviving participant. Distinguishing between documented fact and individual testimony is essential to understanding why this case remains so widely discussed more than 4 decades later. The story begins not with violence, but with ordinary lives. Betty Gore was 30 years old. She worked as an elementary school teacher, was married to Pat Gore, and together they were raising 2 young daughters. Friends and neighbors knew the Gore family through their active involvement in church. Their lives appeared rooted in faith, family, and routine. Candy Montgomery lived nearby with her husband, Pat Montgomery. Like the Gores, the Montgomery family was deeply involved in the same church community. Through shared worship, volunteer activities, and social gatherings, the two families became familiar with one another. Candy and Betty developed what appeared to be a genuine friendship. They worshiped together. They participated in church events together. They spent time in the same social circles. From the outside, there was little reason to imagine that anything unusual existed beneath the surface. But appearances can conceal realities that even close friends fail to recognize. Sometime around 1978, a secret relationship began between Candy Montgomery and Pat Gore. According to their later testimony, the affair was not accidental or impulsive. It was planned. Over a period of months, they met regularly while keeping the relationship hidden from those around them. Eventually, near the end of 1979, both agreed to end the affair. By every outward appearance, life resumed its normal course. The families continued attending church. The friendships within the community appeared unchanged. The secret remained hidden. Most importantly, Betty Gore never learned about the affair while it was taking place. At least, that was the understanding until the morning of June 13, 1980. What happened inside the Gore residence that day has been examined by investigators, attorneys, psychologists, journalists, filmmakers, and countless members of the public ever since. Every piece of evidence has been studied. Every statement has been analyzed. Every legal argument has been debated. Yet despite years of discussion, the central mystery has never completely disappeared. Did Candy Montgomery act in lawful self-defense after being attacked first, as she claimed throughout the investigation and trial? Or did the extraordinary level of violence found at the scene point towards something far beyond what the law considers necessary to protect one's life? Those competing interpretations would eventually confront a Texas jury, but long before the courtroom arguments began, detectives faced the difficult task of reconstructing a confrontation that lasted only minutes yet permanently altered multiple families. When police entered the Gore home, they encountered evidence of an intensely violent struggle. The physical scene left no doubt that something catastrophic had occurred. Medical examination would later determine that Betty Gore died after suffering 41 axe wounds, a finding that immediately shocked investigators and later the public. The sheer number of injuries became one of the defining features of the case, raising questions that neither physical evidence nor testimony could fully resolve. In the months that followed, the case would transform from a local homicide investigation into a national story. Newspapers followed every development. Television coverage expanded public interest. Courtroom testimony became the subject of intense discussion, and opinions quickly divided over whether the law had reached the correct conclusion. Even today, the name Betty Gore evokes not only the memory of a tragic death, but also an enduring legal and moral debate. The facts established by investigators are relatively few compared to the questions that continue to surround them. Between those facts lies a story of friendship, secrecy, betrayal, violence, and a justice system asked to decide what no surviving witness other than the accused could fully explain. To understand how that extraordinary day unfolded, it is first necessary to understand the lives that existed before it, the families, the friendships, and the hidden decisions that quietly shaped the path toward one of Texas's most unforgettable criminal cases. Long before newspaper headlines carried her name across the United States, Betty Gore lived a life that, by all outward appearances, reflected stability, responsibility, and devotion to her family. She was 30 years old, an elementary school teacher, a wife, and the mother of 2 young daughters. In the growing community of Wiley, Texas, she was known less as the future victim of a notorious homicide than as one of many neighbors who quietly contributed to the rhythm of everyday life. Wiley in 1980 was not the kind of place that people associated with sensational crimes. Situated outside the larger urban centers of Texas, it was a community where familiar faces greeted one another at church. Children attended local schools together, and families often crossed paths several times a week. The routines of daily life created an atmosphere in which trust developed naturally. People volunteered together, worshiped together, and shared milestones that marked the passing years. Within that environment, church played an important role in bringing people together. For many families, it was more than a place of worship. It served as the center of social life, where friendships formed through shared faith and regular gatherings. Choir rehearsals, community events, and children's activities created opportunities for neighbors to spend time together outside their homes. It was in this setting that the Gore family and the Montgomery family became closely acquainted. Betty and her husband, Pat Gore, were active members of their church. Friends recognized them as a couple committed to raising their daughters within that faith community. Betty balanced the responsibilities of teaching elementary school with caring for her family, while Pat worked to support their household. From the outside, theirs appeared to be an ordinary marriage built upon familiar routines. Nearby lived Candy Montgomery and her husband, Pat Montgomery. Like the Gores, the Montgomery family participated actively in church life. Their involvement naturally brought the two couples into the same social circles. Week after week, they attended services together. They participated in church activities. Their children grew up within the same community. Familiarity gradually developed into friendship. Among the women, that friendship appeared especially close. Betty and Candy spent time together through church events and choir activities. They knew each other's families. They shared conversations that accompany ordinary friendships between neighbors raising children in the same community. Nothing in those public interactions suggested that their relationship would eventually become the center of one of Texas's most debated criminal cases. To friends and fellow church members, they represented two women living remarkably similar lives. Both were wives. Both were mothers. Both belonged to the same religious community. Both appeared committed to their families. Those similarities made the tragedy that followed even more difficult for many people to understand. Yet beneath the appearance of ordinary friendship, a secret had begun to develop. Around 1978, according to testimony later presented during the investigation and trial, Candy Montgomery and Pat Gore entered into an extramarital relationship. Their own accounts described the affair as something they planned rather than something that happened unexpectedly. They met regularly over a period of months while keeping the relationship hidden from those closest to them. The secrecy surrounding the affair became one of the defining elements of the case. At the time, however, almost no one knew it existed. The church community continued to see two families participating in familiar routines. Neighbors continued seeing close friends spending time together. Nothing outwardly indicated that a hidden relationship connected Candy Montgomery and Pat Gore. Eventually, near the end of 1979, the affair came to an end. According to both Candy and Pat Gore, they mutually agreed to stop seeing each other romantically. From their perspective, that chapter of their lives had concluded. They returned to their marriages, resumed ordinary family life, and continued participating in the same church community. On the surface, everything appeared unchanged. The two families still belonged to the same social circle. Betty and Candy continued seeing one another through church activities. Life moved forward. One fact, however, remained critically important. Betty Gore did not know about the affair during the time it occurred. That undisclosed truth quietly existed beneath every ordinary interaction that followed. Every church gathering, every shared conversation, and every routine meeting between the families took place without Betty's knowledge of the relationship that had once existed between her husband and one of her closest friends. In hindsight, investigators, journalists, and the public would all recognize that hidden affair as the event that connected every major figure in the case. Yet it is equally important to recognize that, according to the documented timeline, the affair itself had already ended months before the fatal confrontation. This distinction would later become significant during both the investigation and the trial. The killing was not presented as the direct continuation of an ongoing affair. Instead, the earlier relationship became part of the broader context surrounding the events that unfolded on June 13, 1980. Understanding that chronology helped investigators reconstruct the relationships between the people involved, even though it did not answer the central question of exactly what happened inside the Gore home. As the months passed after the affair ended, daily life appeared to continue much as before. Families attended church. Children participated in community activities. Neighbors maintained familiar routines. From the perspective of those around them, nothing suggested that these ordinary relationships concealed tensions that would later become central to a homicide investigation. This contrast between appearance and reality became one of the most striking aspects of the case. To the outside world, friendship still existed. The church community continued functioning as it always had. The Gore and Montgomery families remained part of the same social environment. No public conflict drew attention. No documented confrontation signaled that violence was approaching. Only later, after Betty Gore's death, would investigators begin examining the relationships that had existed before June 13th. They would retrace conversations, reconstruct timelines, and attempt to understand how two women who shared so much of their daily lives could ultimately become the only two people present during a deadly confrontation. Those efforts revealed the hidden affair, but they could not answer every question. Knowing that Candy Montgomery and Pat Gore had once been involved explained why investigators considered the relationship important. It explained why detectives focused on Candy after learning she had been the last known person to visit Betty alive. It also explained why the affair became a major subject during the criminal proceedings that followed. Still, one essential fact remained unchanged. No one besides Betty Gore and Candy Montgomery witnessed what occurred inside the house on the morning of June 13, 1980. Everything that happened before that day can be reconstructed through testimony and documented facts. Everything that happened afterward can be examined through physical evidence, investigative records, and courtroom proceedings. But the confrontation itself would forever remain separated from certainty by the absence of a surviving witness other than Candy Montgomery. That uncertainty would define every stage of the investigation, every legal argument presented in court, and every public debate that followed. Before detectives searched the crime scene, before attorneys argued opposing interpretations, and before jurors weighed the evidence, two women who once appeared to be trusted friends would meet one final time inside the Gore family home. What began as an ordinary visit would become the moment that changed both families forever and transformed a quiet Texas community into the setting of one of the state's most enduring and controversial criminal cases. By the end of the 1970s, the lives of the Gore and Montgomery families still appeared, from the outside, to follow the same predictable rhythm that defined much of Wiley's close-knit community. Church services, family responsibilities, and neighborhood friendships continued much as they always had. To those around them, there was little reason to believe that anything significant had changed. Yet beneath that appearance of normality, one secret connected the two families in a way no one else could see. According to testimony later presented during the investigation and at trial, Candy Montgomery and Pat Gore began an extramarital affair around 1978. It was a relationship that neither of them described as impulsive. Instead, both later stated that it was something they discussed and entered into deliberately. Their own accounts indicated that the affair was planned rather than accidental. That fact would become one of the many reasons the case attracted such widespread public attention. The affair was not presented as a brief moment of poor judgment or a spontaneous decision. Instead, testimony suggested that Candy Montgomery and Pat Gore consciously chose to begin a relationship outside their marriages. They met regularly over a period of months while carefully keeping the relationship hidden from their spouses, their church community, and their friends. Throughout that period, life in Wiley continued as though nothing had changed. The Gore family remained active within the church. The Montgomery family did the same. Church events continued to bring both families together. The friendship between Betty Gore and Candy Montgomery appeared unchanged in public. No documented evidence suggested that Betty knew what had been happening behind the scenes. That hidden contrast between public appearances and private decisions became one of the defining features of the case. On one side stood the image familiar to neighbors, two families sharing the same community, attending the same church, and raising children within the same circle of friends. On the other side existed a relationship known only to the two people involved. For investigators looking back after the homicide, this secret became impossible to ignore. It established a direct connection between Candy Montgomery and the Gore family that extended far beyond ordinary friendship. Although the affair itself had ended months before Betty's death, detectives understood that any undisclosed relationship between the individuals involved might help explain the events that followed. Still, investigators also recognized an equally important fact. The affair alone did not explain the killing. According to the documented timeline, Candy Montgomery and Pat Gore mutually agreed to end their relationship near the end of 1979. By their own accounts, they had decided to stop seeing one another romantically and return their attention to their respective marriages. If those statements were accurate, then the affair had concluded several months before June 13, 1980. That chronology mattered. It meant that when investigators reconstructed the sequence of events leading to Betty Gore's death, they could not simply describe the homicide as the immediate result of an ongoing romantic relationship. Instead, they had to consider that the affair belonged to the past while still acknowledging that its existence remained highly relevant. The affair became part of the background against which every later event would be interpreted. During the criminal investigation, detectives sought to understand relationships as well as physical evidence. Knowing who knew each other, who had interacted recently, and whether hidden conflicts existed often proved just as important as documenting the crime scene itself. In this case, the affair immediately raised obvious questions. Had Betty somehow learned about it? Had the relationship continued beyond what Candy and Pat Gore later admitted? Had the affair created tensions that eventually surfaced months later? The available evidence could answer only some of those questions. According to the documented information provided during the investigation and trial, Betty Gore did not know about the affair while it was taking place. 4 months, she continued living within the same church community, interacting with Candy Montgomery as a friend without knowledge of the relationship that had existed between Candy and her husband. That fact makes the events of June 13th particularly significant. When Candy later described the confrontation inside Betty's home, she stated that Betty questioned her about the affair and that she admitted it had happened. Because Betty did not survive, there is no independent account of that conversation. The only surviving description comes from Candy herself. That limitation became central to the case. Investigators could establish many facts independently. They knew when the affair had allegedly begun. They knew that Candy and Pat Gore both acknowledged it. They knew that both described it as having ended months before the killing. But they could not independently verify the exact words exchanged between Betty and Candy inside the Gore residence on the morning of June 13th. The absence of another witness meant that detectives had to distinguish carefully between documented facts and statements provided by the surviving participant. That distinction would later become equally important in court. The prosecution and the defense did not dispute that an affair had occurred. Instead, the affair became part of the broader narrative explaining why the two women found themselves discussing deeply personal matters during what had begun as an ordinary visit. Without the affair, investigators would have struggled to explain why a routine request to borrow a child's swimsuit allegedly turned into a fatal confrontation. With the affair established, the conversation described by Candy became more understandable, even if its precise details could never be independently confirmed. Looking back, it is striking how little appeared different to those outside the two families during the months after the relationship ended. Church attendance continued. Family life appeared unchanged. Neighbors saw no obvious signs that anything extraordinary had happened. The secret remained exactly that, a secret. Only after Betty Gore's death did the hidden relationship become public knowledge. When investigators began interviewing witnesses and reconstructing the connections between the people involved, the affair emerged as one of the most important facts in the entire case. News of its existence quickly spread beyond Wiley, adding another layer of public fascination to a homicide that was already remarkable because of its violence. To many observers, the affair transformed the case from a tragic killing into a story of friendship, betrayal, and devastating consequences. Yet investigators remained focused on something more specific. Their responsibility was not to judge the morality of the affair. Their task was to determine whether it helped explain the circumstances surrounding Betty Gore's death. As the investigation continued, another fact became increasingly significant. On the morning of June 13th, Pat Gore was away on a business trip. Betty was at home. Candy Montgomery went to the Gore residence to borrow one of Betty's daughter's swimsuits for a church activity. That visit was not initially presented as unusual. Friends frequently visited one another. Borrowing items within a close community was entirely ordinary. Nothing about Candy's arrival at the house would necessarily have attracted attention. Only later would investigators realize that it marked the beginning of the final meeting between the two women. Whatever had remained hidden for months was about to become part of a conversation from which only one participant would emerge alive. The affair that had once existed only between Candy Montgomery and Pat Gore was no longer simply a secret of the past. According to Candy's later account, it became the subject of a confrontation that changed every life connected to it. Whether that confrontation unfolded exactly as she described would become the central question facing detectives, prosecutors, defense attorneys, and ultimately the jury. The hidden relationship had remained buried for months, protected by silence and routine. On June 13, 1980, that silence was broken. What followed inside the Gore home would transform a concealed chapter in two families' lives into one of the most controversial homicide cases in modern Texas history. Friday, June 13, 1980, began like countless other mornings in Wiley, Texas. There was nothing in the day's routine to suggest that it would end in one of the most controversial homicide investigations the state had ever seen. Families were preparing for ordinary summer activities, neighbors were going about their daily schedules, and the quiet pace of the community remained undisturbed. For the Gore family, however, the day unfolded under slightly different circumstances. Pat Gore was away on a business trip, leaving Betty at home with her family responsibilities. According to the documented timeline, he was not in Wiley that morning, a fact that would later become important during the investigation because it immediately eliminated him from being present during the fatal confrontation. Betty was alone at the house. At some point that morning, Candy Montgomery arrived at the Gore residence. Her purpose, according to the available records, appeared entirely ordinary. She had come to borrow one of Betty's daughter's swimsuits for an upcoming church activity. Within a close-knit community like Wiley, such requests were neither unusual nor suspicious. Friends often helped one another, and borrowing everyday items was simply part of the trust that existed among neighboring families. Nothing about Candy's arrival suggested that the visit would become historic. Nothing indicated that it would be the last conversation Betty Gore would ever have. From everything that can be documented, the meeting began as an ordinary visit between two women who had known each other through church and community life. The available evidence does not indicate that anyone outside the house witnessed anything unusual before the confrontation began. There were no reports of shouting before the critical moments described later. No independent witness observed the conversation unfold. This absence of witnesses would become one of the defining challenges of the entire case. Because Betty Gore did not survive, investigators would eventually rely on physical evidence, surrounding circumstances, and the account provided by the only surviving participant. According to Candy Montgomery's later statement, the conversation initially proceeded normally. The two women spoke inside the house after Candy arrived to collect the swimsuit. Then, according to Candy, the subject of the past affair emerged. Candy later told investigators that Betty questioned her directly about the relationship she had once had with Pat Gore. The precise words exchanged can never be known. There was no recording. No witness overheard the conversation. No written account exists beyond Candy's later description. Investigators, therefore, faced an unavoidable limitation. They could document that Candy claimed Betty confronted her about the affair, but they could not independently verify how the discussion began, exactly what was said, or the emotional tone of the exchange. Candy stated that she admitted the affair. If her account was accurate, that admission represented the first moment Betty learned that her husband had previously been involved in a relationship with one of her closest friends. How Betty reacted in those first moments can never be established with certainty beyond Candy's testimony. According to Candy's account, Betty became extremely angry. Again, because no other witness survived the encounter, investigators could neither confirm nor completely refute that description. It remained part of Candy's narrative, one that would later be examined closely by detectives, attorneys, and jurors. What happened next became the central issue in the case. Candy stated that Betty went into the utility room and retrieved an axe. According to Candy, Betty ordered her to leave the house. The significance of this claim cannot be overstated. If true, it would support the defense's later argument that Betty initiated the physical confrontation. If untrue, it would fundamentally alter the interpretation of everything that followed. Because Betty was no longer alive to provide her own account, investigators had to examine every available piece of physical evidence while recognizing that they could never hear both sides of the story. Candy further claimed that as she attempted to leave, Betty attacked her with the axe. According to Candy, one of the blows caused a minor injury to her toe. This injury became one of the physical details discussed during the investigation because it formed part of Candy's explanation for why she believed she was in immediate danger. From that point onward, The encounter, as described by Candy, rapidly escalated into a violent struggle. She stated that the two women fought over control of the axe. The confrontation was no longer verbal. It had become physical. Investigators would later find evidence inside the home consistent with a violent struggle having taken place. The crime scene revealed extensive signs of movement and conflict within the utility room. Blood was found throughout the area, indicating that the confrontation had not consisted of a single isolated act, but of a sustained and violent encounter. Physical evidence established that a struggle had occurred. It could not, however, identify who initiated it. That distinction remained one of the most difficult questions investigators confronted. Candy maintained that she eventually succeeded in taking the axe away from Betty. According to her testimony, gaining control of the weapon did not immediately end the confrontation. She claimed Betty continued advancing toward her. Candy stated that she believed she remained in danger. It was at that point, according to her account, that she used the axe against Betty. Exactly how the struggle unfolded during those final moments remains unknown except through Candy's testimony and the physical evidence left behind. Investigators could reconstruct portions of the encounter from the crime scene. They could document where blood was found. They could examine the condition of the room. They could analyze the injuries sustained by Betty Gore. But they could not recreate every movement or determine the precise sequence of every action inside the utility room. That limitation became increasingly significant after the medical examination. The autopsy determined that Betty Gore died after sustaining 41 axe wounds. The sheer number of injuries immediately distinguished the case from many other claims of self-defense. For investigators, the medical findings raised difficult questions. How had a confrontation that allegedly began with an attempt at self-defense resulted in such an extraordinary level of violence? Could the physical evidence alone answer whether the force used remained defensive throughout the encounter? Or did the injuries reflect something beyond what the law would ultimately recognize as lawful self-defense? These questions would later dominate the courtroom. At the scene itself, however, detectives had no immediate answers. They documented what they observed. They collected evidence. They reconstructed the timeline as carefully as possible. Every piece of information became important because there was no surviving witness other than Candy Montgomery. After the confrontation ended, Candy left the Gore residence. According to the documented record, she proceeded to attend church activities as originally planned. Observers later reported no obvious signs of panic or distress that drew immediate attention to her. Meanwhile, inside the Gore home, Betty remained where the violent struggle had ended. No one yet realized that an ordinary visit between two friends had become a fatal encounter. Outside, life in Wiley continued much as it had only hours earlier. Neighbors followed their routines. Church activities went forward. Families remained unaware that one of the community's most shocking crimes had already taken place. The quiet appearance of normality would not last much longer. Before the day was over, concern over Betty Gore's unexplained silence would lead others to the house. What they discovered inside would transform a private confrontation into a homicide investigation that would capture national attention and leave questions that, decades later, continued to divide legal experts, historians, and the public alike. When investigators later attempted to reconstruct what had happened inside the Gore residence on June 13, 1980, they were confronted with a difficult reality. The most critical moments of a case had unfolded behind closed doors. There were no eyewitnesses. No recording existed. Only physical evidence remained, accompanied by the account of the one person who survived. Because of that, every conclusion had to be drawn carefully. The documented facts established where the confrontation ended. They established the injuries sustained by Betty Gore. They established that Candy Montgomery admitted causing Betty's death while maintaining that she had acted in self-defense. Beyond those facts, investigators were forced to compare physical evidence with Candy's description of events. According to Candy's account, the struggle escalated after Betty allegedly attacked her with an axe. Candy stated that she managed to wrestle the weapon away during the fight. Even after gaining control of the axe, she later claimed, Betty continued moving toward her, leaving Candy believing that she remained in immediate danger. It was at that point, according to Candy, that she began striking Betty with the axe. The exact sequence of those blows has never been independently established. No witness could describe how quickly the confrontation unfolded. No surviving participant, other than Candy, could explain what happened from one moment to the next. Investigators therefore relied heavily on the condition of the crime scene. Inside the utility room, they found unmistakable evidence of an intense and violent struggle. Blood was present throughout the area, appearing on the floor, the walls, and nearby objects. The scene demonstrated that the confrontation had not been limited to a single blow or a brief exchange. It reflected a sustained episode of extreme violence. The medical examination provided another crucial piece of evidence. The autopsy determined that Betty Gore had died after sustaining 41 axe wounds. The number itself immediately drew attention, not only from investigators but later from prosecutors, defense attorneys, journalists, and the public. It became one of the most widely discussed aspects of the entire case. Investigators carefully documented every injury because the extent of the wounds would later become central to understanding the legal arguments presented in court. The medical findings also established that many of the injuries had been inflicted after Betty had already lost the ability to defend herself. That fact intensified public reaction once the details became known. To many observers, the level of violence appeared difficult to reconcile with the concept of self-defense. For detectives working the case, however, the role of the investigation was not to reach legal conclusions before all evidence had been examined. Their responsibility was to preserve the scene, document every observable fact, and reconstruct the timeline as accurately as possible. Every bloodstain was photographed. Every item within the utility room was examined. Every available piece of physical evidence was collected. Investigators knew from the beginning that the case would likely depend upon the relationship between forensic evidence and Candy Montgomery's testimony. Since no independent witness had observed the confrontation, the physical scene became the silent witness that detectives hoped would answer the questions no living person besides Candy could address. After the violence ended, Candy left the house. According to the documented timeline, she continued with the plans she already had for the day by attending church activities. Witnesses who later spoke with investigators did not report behavior that immediately suggested she had just been involved in a deadly confrontation. Nothing during those public interactions appears to have alerted members of the church community that a homicide had already taken place. Meanwhile, inside the Gore residence, Betty Gore remained where the confrontation had ended. Hours passed. Outside the home, the routines of everyday life continued uninterrupted. No one yet knew that tragedy had already struck. The situation changed only after Pat Gore, who was away on a business trip, was unable to contact his wife. As concern grew over Betty's unexpected silence, neighbors and law enforcement became involved. Their efforts to check on her welfare ultimately led to the discovery that transformed an unexplained absence into a homicide investigation. When officers entered the Gore home, they encountered a scene unlike anything expected in the quiet community of Wiley. Betty Gore was found dead inside the utility room. The condition of the room immediately indicated that a violent struggle had occurred. Blood evidence was extensive, and investigators quickly recognized that they were dealing with an exceptionally brutal homicide. From that moment, the investigation intensified. Detectives began documenting the residence in detail, preserving evidence, interviewing witnesses, and reconstructing Betty's final known movements. One of the earliest priorities was establishing who had last seen Betty alive. That process led investigators through the ordinary events of the morning. Family members were interviewed. Neighbors were questioned. Individuals connected to church activities provided information about the day's schedule. Gradually, a timeline began to emerge. It established that Candy Montgomery had visited Betty's house that morning to borrow a child's swimsuit for a church event. As detectives continued interviewing members of the church community, they learned that Candy was the last known person to have visited Betty before her death. This fact did not automatically establish criminal responsibility, but it immediately made Candy one of the most important individuals in the investigation. At that stage, detectives were still considering multiple possibilities. The brutality of the crime scene required investigators to remain open to different explanations. They examined whether robbery or another unknown motive might have played a role. Until additional evidence became available, no possibility could be ruled out solely on the basis of initial observations. Yet the timeline increasingly directed attention toward Candy Montgomery. She had been inside the house. She had known Betty personally. She was the last confirmed visitor. These facts alone made further questioning unavoidable. During the investigation, Candy eventually acknowledged that she had caused Betty Gore's death. However, her admission came with a clear explanation. She consistently maintained that everything she had done occurred in self-defense after Betty allegedly attacked her first with the axe. That claim fundamentally shaped the direction of the investigation. The central question was no longer simply who had killed Betty Gore. Candy herself admitted responsibility for the fatal injuries. Instead, investigators had to determine whether the circumstances surrounding the killing supported her assertion that she had acted to protect her own life. The evidence answered some questions while leaving others unresolved. The crime scene confirmed a violent struggle. The autopsy documented the extraordinary number of injuries. Witnesses placed Candy at the house. Candy admitted causing Betty's death. Yet none of those facts alone could establish precisely how the confrontation began or whether every action taken during it met the legal standard for self-defense. That uncertainty ensured the investigation would extend beyond the crime scene and into the courtroom. Detectives had reconstructed as much of the physical evidence as possible. They had identified the principal individuals involved. They had documented the relationship between the victim and the woman who admitted striking the fatal blows. What remained was the legal determination. Could prosecutors prove that Candy Montgomery had committed murder beyond a reasonable doubt? Or would the available evidence leave enough uncertainty for a jury to conclude that the killing, despite its extraordinary violence, could not legally be distinguished from self-defense? Those questions would soon be placed before a Texas courtroom where every detail of the investigation, every piece of physical evidence, and every word of Candy Montgomery's testimony would be examined under the scrutiny of the law. Once the initial crime scene examination had been completed, the investigation entered a new phase. Detectives were no longer focused solely on documenting physical evidence inside the Gore residence. Their attention shifted toward reconstructing the relationships between everyone connected to the case and determining whether the available evidence supported a criminal charge beyond Candy Montgomery's own admission that she had caused Betty Gore's death. The challenge facing investigators was unlike that of many homicide cases. Ordinarily, detectives attempt to identify an unknown offender. In this investigation, however, the identity of the person responsible for the fatal injuries was not the central mystery. Candy Montgomery ultimately acknowledged that she had killed Betty Gore. The unresolved question was why the killing had occurred and whether the circumstances justified her claim of self-defense. To answer that question, detectives began reviewing the hours leading up to the confrontation. Witnesses from the church community were interviewed. Neighbors were questioned. Investigators carefully reconstructed the timeline of June 13, 1980. Those interviews consistently established that Candy Montgomery had visited Betty Gore's home that morning to borrow a child's swimsuit for a church activity. They also confirmed that Candy was the last known person to see Betty alive. At the same time, detectives continued exploring alternative possibilities. The brutality of the crime scene required them to avoid reaching premature conclusions. During the early stages of the investigation, robbery and other potential motives were considered. Investigators understood that every homicide investigation demands an objective evaluation of all reasonable explanations before arriving at a final conclusion. As evidence accumulated, however, the timeline increasingly pointed back to Candy Montgomery. She had been inside the house. She admitted causing Betty's death. She claimed she had acted only after Betty attacked her first. The investigation therefore became centered on evaluating that explanation. Detectives compared Candy's account with the physical evidence recovered from the crime scene. They examined the condition of the utility room, where investigators had documented clear signs of a violent struggle. Blood evidence confirmed that an intense confrontation had occurred, but it could not independently establish who initiated the violence. That limitation remained one of the most significant obstacles throughout the investigation. No independent eyewitness had been present. No surveillance recording existed. No audio recording captured the conversation that allegedly preceded the fight. Everything investigators learned about the beginning of the confrontation came from Candy Montgomery herself. Because Betty Gore did not survive, detectives could never compare Candy's description with another first-hand account. As the investigation progressed, Candy maintained a consistent explanation. She admitted striking Betty Gore with the axe. She continued insisting that she had done so only after Betty attacked her first. According to Candy, she believed her own life remained in danger even after she gained control of the weapon because Betty allegedly continued advancing toward her. The investigators documented her statement, but determining whether the law supported that explanation would ultimately become the responsibility of the courts. By the time the investigation concluded, prosecutors believed sufficient evidence existed to bring the case to trial. The proceedings began in October 1980 and immediately attracted widespread public attention. News organizations closely followed the case, recognizing that it involved not only a brutal killing but also a legal argument that would challenge public understanding of self-defense. Inside the courtroom, the facts themselves were not heavily disputed. Betty Gore had died. Candy Montgomery admitted causing her death. The central disagreement involved the legal interpretation of the confrontation. The defense argued that Candy had acted to save her own life. According to the defense, Betty had initiated the violence by attacking first with the axe. Candy's attorneys maintained that every action she took afterward occurred within the context of defending herself from a deadly assault. To strengthen that argument, the defense presented testimony from a psychological expert. According to the testimony introduced during the trial, Candy experienced a dissociative reaction rooted in repressed childhood memories. The defense suggested that this psychological response contributed to the extreme level of violence during the confrontation. The testimony did not deny that Betty Gore had suffered 41 axe wounds. Instead, it attempted to explain how Candy's mental state, as described by the expert, might account for the intensity of her actions while still remaining consistent with a claim of self-defense. The prosecution viewed the evidence very differently. Prosecutors focused on the extraordinary number of injuries sustained by Betty Gore. They argued that 41 axe wounds were inconsistent with reasonable self-defense and contended that the amount of force used exceeded what would have been necessary to protect oneself from an attack. For the prosecution, the medical evidence represented one of the strongest arguments against Candy's version of events. The defense, however, reminded jurors of another equally important fact. No one besides Candy Montgomery had survived the confrontation. Without another eyewitness, prosecutors faced the difficult burden imposed by the criminal justice system. It was not enough to demonstrate that the killing appeared violent or disturbing. They had to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Candy's actions were not legally justified. Throughout the trial, jurors were asked to consider two competing interpretations of the same event. One interpretation portrayed the killing as an act of unlawful violence. The other described it as an act of self-defense during a deadly struggle. The physical evidence established the consequences of the confrontation. Candy's testimony explained how she believed the confrontation began. The jury was responsible for deciding whether the prosecution had eliminated reasonable doubt. After deliberating, the jurors reached their decision. Candy Montgomery was found not guilty. The verdict did not declare that the events inside the Gore residence had been fully understood or that every question had been answered. Instead, it reflected the jury's conclusion that the prosecution had failed to prove the murder charge beyond a reasonable doubt in light of the self-defense claim presented during the trial. The decision immediately divided public opinion. Many believed the jury had faithfully applied the legal standard required in a criminal case. Because uncertainty remained about exactly how the confrontation began, they argued that the prosecution had not met its burden of proof. Others found the verdict deeply troubling. For them, the severity of Betty Gore's injuries appeared impossible to reconcile with the concept of lawful self-defense. They questioned how a killing involving 41 axe wounds could end with an acquittal. Those opposing reactions ensured that the controversy surrounding the case did not end when the trial concluded. Instead, the verdict marked the beginning of a much longer public debate. Legal experts, journalists, and members of the public continued discussing the case for years afterward. The questions raised during the trial extended beyond the specific facts of June 13, 1980. They touched on broader issues concerning the limits of self-defense, the role of psychological testimony in criminal proceedings, and the responsibility of juries when critical events are known only through the account of a surviving participant. Although the courtroom proceedings came to an end, the case itself remained firmly embedded in public memory. Decades later, it would continue attracting renewed attention through books, documentaries, and television dramatizations. Yet behind every legal argument and every adaptation remained the same undeniable fact. Betty Gore lost her life inside her own home, and the circumstances surrounding her death continue to challenge simple explanations. The investigation reached its legal conclusion, but the questions it raised have never completely disappeared. The verdict in the case of Betty Gore and Candy Montgomery brought a legal conclusion, but it did not bring universal agreement. When the jury found Candy Montgomery not guilty, the courtroom proceedings ended, yet the debate surrounding the case continued far beyond the walls of the courthouse. For some people, the decision represented the justice system functioning as it was designed to function. The burden in a criminal trial rests with the prosecution, and the jury must determine whether the evidence proves guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. In this case, jurors were presented with a situation where the only surviving account of the confrontation came from the person who caused the fatal injuries. For others, the verdict remained difficult to accept. The physical evidence remained a powerful and disturbing part of the case. Betty Gore had suffered 41 axe wounds, and the violence of the crime scene became the detail that shaped much of the public reaction. Many people struggled to understand how such an extreme level of violence could be considered self-defense. The disagreement reflected the central tension of the entire case. The law required jurors to consider whether prosecutors had proven that Candy Montgomery committed murder. The public often considered a different question: how could a confrontation between two people who once shared a friendship end with one woman dead and the other woman acquitted? Those questions were not easily separated. The case forced many observers to examine the difference between legal responsibility and moral judgment. A jury's decision is based on evidence presented in court and the standards required by law. Public opinion, however, often develops through emotion, personal beliefs, and interpretations of events that may never be fully known. The uncertainty surrounding the beginning of the confrontation remained at the heart of the controversy. According to Candy's testimony, Betty initiated the physical violence by attacking her with an axe. Candy maintained that she acted in fear and that she believed she needed to defend herself. But Betty was never able to provide her own account. Because of that, one of the most important moments in the case, the exact beginning of the confrontation, remained known only through Candy's statement. This absence of a second perspective shaped everything that followed. Investigators could establish that the two women had a history together. They could confirm the existence of the affair between Candy Montgomery and Pat Gore. They could document Candy's presence at the Gore residence on the morning of June 13, 1980. They could analyze the crime scene and the injuries suffered by Betty. But they could not recreate every moment inside the utility room with complete certainty. That uncertainty became the foundation of the defense argument and one of the greatest challenges for the prosecution. The case also continued to attract attention because of the relationship between the people involved. It was not a crime involving strangers. It was not a random encounter between unknown individuals. The victim and the person responsible for her death had shared the same community, attended the same church, and once considered each other friends. That personal connection made the tragedy especially difficult for those who knew the families. Betty Gore was remembered not only through the circumstances of her death, but through the life she had lived before it. She was a teacher, a mother, a wife, and a member of her community. The details of the criminal case often focused on the confrontation that ended her life, but behind those legal arguments was the loss experienced by her family and everyone who knew her. The case also raised questions about trust. In a close community like Wiley, friendships were built through shared experiences. Neighbors attended the same churches, participated in the same activities, and relied on one another. The discovery that a hidden relationship existed between two people connected through that community changed how many people viewed the events surrounding the tragedy. The revelation of the affair added another layer of complexity. Before the homicide, Candy and Betty were known publicly as friends. After the homicide, their relationship became one of the most discussed aspects of the case. The contrast between friendship and betrayal became central to the way the story was understood by the public. However, the legal proceedings did not focus on whether the affair was morally acceptable. The court's responsibility was narrower. It had to determine whether the killing met the legal definition of murder, or whether Candy's claim of self-defense created enough uncertainty to prevent a conviction. That distinction is important because the case was not decided on the basis of whether people approved of the choices made before the killing. It was decided on evidence related to the confrontation itself, and whether the prosecution could meet the required standard of proof. Over time, the case became a subject of continued discussion among those interested in criminal justice, psychology, and the complexities of human behavior. The role of psychological testimony became one area of particular interest. During the trial, the defense introduced testimony suggesting that Candy experienced a dissociative reaction connected to repressed childhood memories. This argument became part of the explanation presented to the jury regarding the intensity of the violence. For some observers, psychological testimony provided important context about human reactions under extreme stress. For others, it raised difficult questions about how mental states should be considered in criminal cases. The case also continued to be examined because it represented a challenging example of self-defense law. Self-defense claims often depend on questions that cannot always be answered through physical evidence alone. Was the person facing immediate danger? Did they reasonably believe force was necessary? Did the response remain within the limits allowed by law? In the Candy Montgomery case, those questions were particularly difficult because the confrontation ended with the death of the only other person who could have provided another first-hand account. Decades after the trial, the case remains controversial precisely because it contains both clear facts and unanswered questions. The facts are documented. Betty Gore died on June 13, 1980. Candy Montgomery admitted causing her death. The medical examination documented 41 axe wounds. A jury found Candy not guilty after considering the evidence presented. But the questions surrounding the confrontation itself remain debated. What exactly was said during those final moments between the two women? How did the argument escalate into violence? At what point did the struggle become fatal? These questions continue to fuel discussion because the answers cannot be fully recovered. The case eventually entered popular culture through books, documentaries, and television adaptations. Each new portrayal introduced the story to another generation, bringing renewed attention to the people involved and the unresolved debates surrounding the verdict. However, beyond the courtroom arguments and media coverage, the most important reality remains unchanged. A woman named Betty Gore lost her life. Her death changed the lives of her family, her friends, and an entire community. The legal system reached its conclusion with an acquittal, but the emotional impact of the case continued. For those who follow the story, it became an example of how a single event can leave behind competing narratives, conflicting interpretations, and questions that remain long after the official proceedings have ended. The case of Betty Gore and Candy Montgomery endures because it exists in that difficult space between certainty and uncertainty. It demonstrates the limits of what evidence can reveal and the challenges faced when justice must be decided in the absence of complete knowledge. More than 40 years later, people continue returning to the same moment in time, the morning of June 13, 1980, when a visit between two women who once shared a friendship became a tragedy that would forever change the way their names were remembered. More than 4 decades after the death of Betty Gore, the case involving her and Candy Montgomery continues to occupy a unique place in the history of American true crime. Many criminal cases fade from public attention after a verdict is delivered. The legal process ends, the headlines disappear, and the people involved gradually become names found only in old records. This case followed a different path. The questions surrounding Betty Gore's death remained powerful because the case contained elements that were difficult to reconcile. It involved friendship and betrayal, ordinary community life and extreme violence, a confession and an acquittal. It presented a situation where many facts were known, yet some of the most important moments remained impossible to verify completely. The story continued not because the legal outcome was unclear, but because people continued debating what that outcome meant. At the center of the case was a woman whose life ended inside her own home. Betty Gore was remembered by those who knew her as a mother, a teacher, a wife, and a member of the Wiley community. However, after June 13, 1980, her name became permanently connected to the circumstances of her death. The attention surrounding the trial often focused on the arguments made by attorneys and the testimony of the accused, but behind every legal discussion was the reality that a family lost a loved one. The tragedy affected more than just the two women directly involved. It affected their families. It affected their church community. It affected the people who had known them before the crime transformed their lives. Before the homicide, Betty Gore and Candy Montgomery existed within the same social world. They were not strangers brought together by coincidence. They were two women who shared common surroundings, friendships, and community connections. That history made the case especially difficult for many people to understand. The idea that two friends could become involved in such a violent confrontation challenged the assumptions people often make about those closest to them. The case demonstrated that relationships can contain hidden conflicts and unknown details even when everything appears normal from the outside. The discovery of the affair between Candy Montgomery and Pat Gore changed the way many people viewed the events leading up to the homicide. For investigators, the affair was an important part of understanding the connection between the individuals involved. For the public, it became one of the most emotionally charged aspects of the story. It introduced themes of secrecy and betrayal into a case already defined by violence. However, the legal proceedings did not simply ask whether betrayal had occurred. They asked a much narrower and more difficult question: whether Candy Montgomery had committed murder, or whether the circumstances supported her claim of self-defense. That distinction became the foundation of the trial. The prosecution and defense approached the same event from completely different perspectives. The prosecution focused on the physical evidence. The 41 axe wounds suffered by Betty Gore became the central symbol of their argument. Prosecutors argued that the level of violence was far beyond what would be expected from a person acting only to protect herself. They argued that the evidence showed an excessive use of force. The defense focused on the circumstances surrounding the confrontation. They argued that Candy had been attacked first and that she acted because she believed she was in danger. They emphasized that no eyewitness existed to contradict Candy's description of the events. The jury ultimately had to decide whether the prosecution had removed all reasonable doubt. That responsibility placed them in the difficult position of evaluating an event that no one else had directly witnessed. Their decision reflected the standard required in criminal cases. A person cannot be convicted simply because a situation appears suspicious or disturbing. The evidence must prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. When the jury returned a not guilty verdict, the legal case ended. But public discussion continued. Some people view the decision as a reminder that the justice system must protect defendants from convictions based on uncertainty. Others viewed it as a failure to deliver accountability for a death they believed was unjustified. Both reactions demonstrated how deeply the case affected public perception. Over time, the story became a subject of books, documentaries, and television productions. Each adaptation introduced the case to new audiences and renewed interest in the events of 1980. The television film A Killing in a Small Town in 1990 brought the case to viewers years after the trial. Later, the miniseries Candy in 2022 and Love and Death in 2023 introduced new generations to the story and explored the relationships, decisions, and consequences surrounding the tragedy. The continued interest in these adaptations reflects the unusual combination of elements within the case. It was not only a story about a crime. It was also a story about human relationships and the choices people make before a tragedy occurs. It examined how secrets can remain hidden within ordinary lives. It explored how a single moment can permanently alter the future of multiple families. It raised questions about memory, perception, fear, and responsibility. Perhaps the most enduring question is not simply what happened inside the Gore home, but how people should understand an event when complete certainty is impossible. Criminal justice systems are often asked to make decisions despite incomplete information. Courts must examine evidence, evaluate testimony, and reach conclusions based on legal standards. Yet outside the courtroom, people often continue searching for answers that the legal process cannot always provide. The case of Betty Gore and Candy Montgomery represents that tension. The jury reached a verdict. The legal system reached its conclusion. But the public conversation continued. The reason is that the case exists between two realities. One reality consists of documented facts. Betty Gore died on June 13, 1980. Candy Montgomery admitted causing her death. The jury found her not guilty. Those events are established. The other reality consists of unanswered questions. The exact words spoken between the two women. The precise sequence of actions during the confrontation. The thoughts and emotions experienced in those final moments. Those details remain beyond complete recovery. This is why the case has continued to attract attention. It is not only because of the violence involved, but because it forces people to confront the uncomfortable limits of certainty. In many true crime stories, the passage of time eventually brings clarity. In this case, time has brought reflection, discussion, and renewed examination, but not complete resolution. The name Candy Montgomery remains associated with one of Texas's most controversial acquittals. The name Betty Gore remains associated with a tragedy that ended a life and forever changed a community. Behind the headlines, however, remains the story of real people whose lives were altered in a matter of minutes. A friendship became a criminal investigation. A private secret became public knowledge. A quiet Texas community became the setting for a nationally discussed trial. And a single day in June 1980 became a moment that continues to raise difficult questions about justice, self-defense, and the search for truth when the full story can never be completely known. Every criminal case reaches a point where the legal process comes to an end. Evidence has been presented. Witnesses have testified. Attorneys have made their arguments. A jury has delivered its decision. The courtroom grows quiet, the files are archived, and the justice system moves on to the next case. The case of Betty Gore did all of those things. Yet it never truly ended. More than 40 years have passed since the morning of June 13, 1980, but the questions raised by that day continue to resonate. Not because new evidence has dramatically altered the facts, nor because the verdict has been overturned, but because the case occupies an unusual space where legal certainty and public certainty do not entirely overlap. The law answered one question. The jury concluded that prosecutors had not proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Candy Montgomery committed murder. That verdict remains the official legal conclusion of the case. But the law was never asked to answer every question people continue to ask. It could not explain every moment inside the Gore home. It could not reconstruct every word spoken between the two women. It could not remove every uncertainty left behind by the absence of another surviving witness. Those unanswered questions became part of the legacy of the case itself. For investigators, the available evidence established several important facts. Betty Gore died on June 13, 1980, inside her home in Wiley, Texas. Candy Montgomery admitted that she caused Betty's death. The confrontation involved an axe. The medical examination documented 41 axe wounds. A violent struggle had occurred. Those facts have never been disputed. The uncertainty lay elsewhere. Only one person survived the confrontation. Only one person described how the violence began. Only one person explained why she believed her actions were necessary. The justice system evaluated that explanation under the standard required by criminal law. The jury ultimately determined that the prosecution had not eliminated reasonable doubt. Whether every observer agrees with that conclusion is another matter entirely. Cases like this remind us that a courtroom is designed to answer legal questions, not philosophical ones. A jury decides whether the evidence satisfies the law. It does not determine whether every mystery has been solved. It does not erase grief. It does not restore what has been lost. For Betty Gore's family, the verdict could never change the reality that a wife and mother had died. Long after the trial concluded, they continued living with an absence that no legal decision could repair. For the Wiley community, the case represented the loss of a sense of certainty. Before June 1980, the town had seemed like a place where neighbors trusted one another without hesitation. The homicide challenged that perception. It demonstrated that extraordinary tragedies can emerge from ordinary lives and familiar relationships. The case also became a lasting example of how hidden decisions can carry consequences far beyond the people who make them. The affair between Candy Montgomery and Pat Gore remained secret while it occurred. According to the documented record, it ended months before the fatal confrontation. Yet after Betty Gore's death, that secret became central to understanding the relationships among everyone involved. Although the affair itself was not the legal issue before the court, it formed part of the broader context surrounding the events of June 13th. Without it, investigators would have struggled to explain why the two women were discussing deeply personal matters during what had begun as an ordinary visit. Even today, discussions of the case often return to the same themes: trust, friendship, betrayal, fear, violence, justice. Each person who studies the case may emphasize different aspects, but none can escape the central reality that a life was lost. That reality deserves to remain at the center of the story. Over the years, films and television adaptations introduced the case to audiences who had never heard of Betty Gore or Candy Montgomery. Productions such as A Killing in a Small Town, Candy, and Love and Death brought renewed public attention to the events of 1980. These dramatizations reflect the continuing fascination surrounding the case, but they also highlight an important distinction. Dramatic retellings can encourage discussion, yet they are interpretations of historical events rather than replacements for the documented record. The actual case remains grounded in the evidence presented during the investigation and trial, the testimony given under oath, and the verdict ultimately returned by the jury. The enduring interest in the case speaks to something larger than a single criminal investigation. It illustrates how difficult it can be to understand human behavior during moments of extreme crisis. It demonstrates the challenges investigators face when crucial events occur without independent witnesses. It reminds us that physical evidence, while powerful, cannot always answer every question about intent, perception, or fear. Perhaps that is why the case continues to be discussed decades later. Not because every answer has been found, but because some answers may never be. As time passes, many true crime stories gradually lose their emotional impact. Witnesses grow older, communities change, and public attention shifts elsewhere. The story of Betty Gore has resisted that pattern. It remains relevant because it asks questions that extend beyond one particular courtroom. How should the justice system evaluate self-defense when only one participant survives? How should juries weigh physical evidence against personal testimony? Can every tragedy be fully understood through legal proceedings alone? There are no simple responses. What remains instead is a documented history of one summer morning that altered many lives forever. A teacher never returned home. A family lost a wife and mother. Another family became permanently connected to one of the most controversial homicide cases in Texas history. A community learned that even familiar places can become the setting for unimaginable events. And a jury, after hearing all the evidence presented, reached a verdict that continues to inspire debate more than 4 decades later. Perhaps the greatest lesson of the Betty Gore case is not found in the verdict itself, but in the humility it demands from those who examine it. The documented facts deserve careful attention. The unanswered questions deserve honest acknowledgement. The victim deserves to be remembered as more than a headline. Betty Gore was not simply the subject of a famous trial. She was a person whose life ended far too soon, leaving behind family, friends, and a community forever changed. The legal proceedings concluded in 1980. The public conversation continues today. Between those two realities lies the lasting legacy of the Betty Gore case, a story that reminds us both of the importance of evidence and of the limits of certainty when only one voice remains to describe the final moments of another person's life. The story of Betty Gore and Candy Montgomery did not end when the jury delivered its verdict. In many criminal cases, a decision in court provides a final moment that allows society to move forward. But this case remained different because the verdict answered a legal question while leaving many emotional and moral questions unresolved. The jury determined that Candy Montgomery was not guilty. Legally, that decision meant that prosecutors had not proven beyond a reasonable doubt that she had committed murder. The court had reached its conclusion, but outside the courtroom, people continued to struggle with the same difficult questions that had surrounded the case from the beginning. How could a friendship between two women from the same community end in such violence? How could a confrontation involving an axe and 41 wounds result in an acquittal? How should people understand an event when the person who died could never provide her own account? These questions helped transform the case from a local tragedy into a story that continued to attract national attention. For many people who followed the trial, the strongest image associated with the case was the crime scene itself. The extent of Betty Gore's injuries became the detail that shaped much of the public reaction. To many observers, the violence appeared overwhelming and difficult to connect with the idea of self-defense. The prosecution had focused heavily on that point. Their argument was that the level of force used was not consistent with simply protecting oneself from danger. The number of injuries suffered by Betty became central to their effort to convince the jury that the killing went beyond what the law would consider justified. For those who agreed with the prosecution's perspective, the verdict created a painful contradiction. They saw a woman who had lost her life in an extremely violent manner, yet the person responsible was found not guilty. They questioned whether the legal system had placed too much emphasis on uncertainty and not enough emphasis on the consequences of the violence. However, those who supported the verdict viewed the situation differently. They focused on the fundamental requirement of criminal law: guilt must be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. From this perspective, the absence of another eyewitness was crucial. The jury had to consider the possibility that Candy's account of the confrontation was true. If there was a reasonable possibility that she had acted in self-defense, then the law required an acquittal. This difference in perspective explains why the case remained controversial. The debate was not simply about whether people believed Candy Montgomery or Betty Gore. It was about how people interpreted incomplete information. The legal system had to examine evidence according to strict standards. The public often examined the case through personal reactions, emotions, and beliefs about what seemed fair. Those two approaches do not always lead to the same conclusion. One of the most difficult aspects of the case was that the truth of the confrontation existed in a space where evidence and uncertainty overlapped. The physical evidence showed the result of the violence. It showed the injuries. It showed the location. It showed that a deadly confrontation had occurred. But physical evidence could not reveal every thought, emotion, or decision made during those final moments. It could not independently confirm the exact words exchanged between Betty and Candy. It could not provide Betty's perspective. It could not answer every question about what happened before the fatal injuries were inflicted. That limitation remained the foundation of the legal debate. The case also continued to attract attention because of the relationship between the victim and the person who admitted causing her death. The public often struggles to understand crimes involving people who once trusted each other. When violence occurs between strangers, the focus is often on motive and opportunity. When violence occurs between friends, the questions become more personal. People want to understand how a relationship that once appeared ordinary could reach such a devastating conclusion. In the case of Betty and Candy, the hidden affair added another layer of complexity. The relationship between Candy Montgomery and Pat Gore had ended months before the killing, according to testimony presented during the case. Yet once it became public, it changed how many people viewed the events leading up to June 13, 1980. The affair introduced themes of secrecy and betrayal into a story already defined by tragedy. For some observers, it became a symbol of the hidden conflicts that can exist beneath seemingly normal relationships. For investigators and the courts, however, the central issue remained narrower. What happened during the confrontation inside the Gore home, and whether Candy's actions met the legal definition of murder. That distinction is important because the criminal justice system does not decide cases based solely on whether someone's actions appear morally wrong. It must determine whether those actions satisfy specific legal requirements. The case also became significant because of the psychological testimony presented during the trial. The defense introduced expert testimony suggesting that Candy experienced a dissociative reaction connected to repressed childhood memories. This testimony was intended to provide context for the intensity of the violence and explain her mental state during the confrontation. The use of psychological evidence in criminal trials has long been a subject of debate. Some believe such testimony can help courts understand human behavior under extreme circumstances. Others question how much influence psychological explanations should have when evaluating responsibility for violent acts. The Candy Montgomery case became one example of that broader discussion. It demonstrated how difficult it can be to separate questions of intent, mental state, and responsibility when a case involves both severe violence and a claim of self-defense. Years after the trial, The case continued to be revisited because each new discussion returned to the same unresolved tension. Was this a case of a woman defending herself from a deadly attack? Or was it a case where violence continued beyond what was necessary? The jury answered that question according to the evidence and legal standards presented in 1980. The public continued answering it in different ways. That division is part of why the case has remained one of the most recognized homicide cases in Texas history. It represents the difficult reality that justice does not always produce a conclusion that satisfies everyone. A verdict can close a courtroom proceeding, but it cannot erase grief, change personal beliefs, or eliminate every unanswered question. The legacy of the case is therefore not only the verdict itself, it is also the conversation that followed. The case encouraged discussions about self-defense laws, the role of psychological testimony, the challenges of investigating crimes without eyewitnesses, and the responsibility of juries when evidence leaves room for more than one interpretation. Most importantly, it continued reminding the public that behind every legal argument are real people whose lives are permanently changed. Betty Gore became known because of the circumstances of her death, but her story began long before that day. She was a teacher, a mother, a wife, and a member of a community. The attention surrounding the case often focused on the accused and the trial, but the foundation of the story remains the loss of a human life. The controversy surrounding the case may continue for generations because it represents a question that many criminal cases eventually confront. What happens when the evidence reveals what occurred, but not every detail of why it occurred? In the end, the case of Betty Gore and Candy Montgomery remains a story defined by both facts and uncertainty. The facts established what happened afterward. The uncertainty surrounds the moments that led there. And between those two realities exists the reason this case continues to be remembered, discussed, and debated decades after that summer day in Wiley, Texas. More than 40 years have passed since June 13, 1980, yet the case of Betty Gore and Candy Montgomery continues to hold a place among the most discussed and controversial criminal cases in Texas history. Time has passed, communities have changed, and new generations have learned the story through books, documentaries, and television adaptations. But the questions surrounding that day have never completely disappeared. The reason is not simply the violence of the crime. It is the complexity of the people involved, the uncertainty surrounding the confrontation, and the difficult balance between legal judgment and human understanding. At the center of the case is a woman whose life ended inside her own home. Before her name became associated with a famous homicide investigation, Betty Gore was a teacher, a mother, a wife, and a member of her community. She lived a life that appeared ordinary in many ways, built around family responsibilities, friendships, and involvement in church activities. The circumstances of her death eventually became known across the country, but the tragedy itself was much more personal than the headline suggested. A family lost someone they loved. Children lost their mother. Friends lost a member of their community. Behind every legal argument and every public discussion was a human loss that could never be reversed. The story of Betty Gore is often remembered through the actions of another person, through courtroom testimony, and through debates about self-defense. Yet remembering the victim requires looking beyond the events of one terrible day. It requires recognizing that Betty existed as a person before she became part of a criminal case. She had relationships. She had responsibilities. She had a place within her community. Those aspects of her life remain important because a homicide investigation can sometimes reduce a person to only the circumstances surrounding their death. But Betty Gore was more than the final moments of her life. She was someone whose absence changed the lives of everyone who knew her. The case also remains significant because it demonstrates the challenges faced by the justice system when complete certainty is impossible. Courts are designed to evaluate evidence and apply the law. They must make decisions based on the information available, even when some questions cannot be answered. In the case of Betty Gore and Candy Montgomery, the jury had to consider a confrontation that no one else witnessed. They had to evaluate physical evidence. They had to consider testimony. They had to determine whether the prosecution had proven its case beyond a reasonable doubt. Their decision resulted in an acquittal. That verdict became the official legal conclusion. But an acquittal does not erase the complexity of the events that led to it. It does not mean that every question has been answered. It does not mean that every person who hears the story will reach the same conclusion. Instead, it reflects one of the most difficult realities of criminal justice. Sometimes the law must make decisions even when the complete truth cannot be recovered. The case also remains a powerful example of how relationships can hide realities that are invisible to others. To the Wiley community, Betty Gore and Candy Montgomery appear to share a friendship built through church and common experiences. Their families existed within the same social world. They attended the same gatherings and knew one another through familiar connections. Yet behind that public image existed a secret relationship between Candy and Pat Gore. The affair became a significant part of the investigation because it revealed a connection between the people involved that had not been known publicly. It helped explain why the two women were together on the morning of June 13th. However, the existence of the affair did not provide a complete explanation for the tragedy. It was part of the background. The confrontation itself remained the central unanswered moment. That is why the case has continued to be examined decades later. It raises questions that extend beyond this particular incident. How should society understand self-defense when only one person survives a violent confrontation? How should juries evaluate testimony when physical evidence reveals the result, but not every moment leading to it? How can anyone fully understand a tragedy when important details remain known only to those who were there? These questions have no simple answers. Perhaps that is why the case continues to attract attention through documentaries and dramatizations. Productions such as A Killing in a Small Town, Candy, and Love and Death introduced different generations to the events surrounding the case. They explored the relationships, the investigation, and the courtroom battle that followed. Yet every retelling returns to the same reality. A woman died, a community was changed, a legal decision was reached, and questions remained. The lasting importance of a case is not that it provides easy answers. Instead, it shows how complicated human events can become when fear, relationships, personal choices, and legal standards collide. It reminds us that every criminal case contains more than evidence and arguments. It contains lives. It contains families. It contains people whose futures are permanently altered. The case of Betty Gore and Candy Montgomery remains remembered because it challenges the desire for simple explanations. It exists in a space where some facts are certain and some details remain forever beyond reach. The facts are clear. Betty Gore died on June 13, 1980. Candy Montgomery admitted causing her death. The jury found Candy not guilty. Those events form the foundation of the historical record. But the questions surrounding the confrontation itself continue to inspire discussion because they involve issues that are deeply human. Fear, trust, betrayal, survival, and responsibility. As time moves forward, the story will likely continue to be studied and debated. But any examination of the case should begin with the person whose life was lost. Betty Gore was not simply a name in a criminal file. She was a person who mattered to her family and her community. Her story deserves to be remembered not only because of the tragedy that ended her life, but because of the life she lived before that moment. The events of June 13, 1980, transformed a quiet Texas community and created one of the most debated homicide cases in the country. The investigation ended. The trial ended. The verdict was delivered. But the search for understanding continues. And perhaps the greatest lesson of the case is that justice is not always the same as certainty. Sometimes the legal system must decide with incomplete information. Sometimes communities must live with unanswered questions. Sometimes history remembers not only what happened, but the difficulty of ever knowing everything that happened. The name Betty Gore remains connected to a tragedy that shocked Texas. The name Candy Montgomery remains connected to one of the most controversial acquittals in American criminal history. Together, their story remains a reminder of how quickly ordinary lives can be changed, how fragile trust can become, and how the pursuit of truth continues even when the final answers remain out of reach. Although the story of Betty Gore and Candy Montgomery reached its legal conclusion in 1980, the case never truly disappeared from public memory. The verdict closed one chapter, but it did not erase the questions that had surrounded the tragedy from the beginning. Years after the trial ended, people continued returning to the same central moment, the confrontation inside the Gore home on June 13, 1980. It was a moment witnessed by only two people. One of them lost her life. The other became the only person who could describe what happened inside that room. That reality shaped every part of the case. It shaped the investigation. It shaped the courtroom arguments. It shaped the way the public understood the tragedy. The death of Betty Gore remains one of those cases where the known facts and the unanswered questions exist side by side. The facts are established. Betty Gore was killed in her home in Wiley, Texas. Candy Montgomery acknowledged that she caused Betty's death. The confrontation involved an axe. The medical examination documented 41 axe wounds. A jury later found Candy Montgomery not guilty after hearing the evidence and considering her claim of self-defense. Those facts form the foundation of the historical record. But beyond those facts remain the questions that have continued to attract attention for decades. What exactly happened during the final conversation between Betty and Candy? How did a visit between two women who once considered each other friends become a deadly confrontation? At what point did the situation change from an argument into violence? These questions remain central because the case does not provide the kind of complete picture that people often seek in criminal investigations. There was no second survivor. There was no independent witness inside the home. There was no way to hear Betty Gore's final perspective. The justice system had to make a decision based on the evidence available, but history has continued to examine the spaces where certainty ends. Perhaps the most striking aspect of the case is the contrast between the lives that existed before the tragedy and the events that followed. Before June 13, 1980, Betty Gore and Candy Montgomery were not connected by crime. They were connected by community. They attended the same church. They participated in similar activities. They lived within the same social environment. Their families knew one another. To people around them, their relationship appeared ordinary. That image changed forever after Betty's death. The discovery that Candy and Pat Gore had previously been involved in an affair added another layer to a case that was already difficult to understand. The revelation transformed a private matter into a public discussion about trust, friendship, and hidden conflicts. However, the affair alone could not explain the tragedy. It provided context, but it did not answer every question. The central issue remained the confrontation itself, and whether Candy Montgomery's actions were legally justified. That question was ultimately decided by the jury. The verdict demonstrated one of the most important principles of criminal law: a person cannot be convicted unless the evidence proves guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. For those who supported the verdict, that principle was the foundation of justice. They believed the uncertainty surrounding the confrontation meant that the prosecution had not met its burden. For those who disagreed with the outcome, the violence documented in the crime scene remained impossible to ignore. They believed the severity of Betty's injuries raised serious questions about whether the actions could truly be considered self-defense. The division between those viewpoints is one of the reasons the case has remained memorable. It represents a difficult reality that appears in many criminal investigations. The law must reach a conclusion, even when human beings continue searching for answers. The case also demonstrates the lasting impact of a crime on everyone connected to it. For Betty's family, the legal outcome could never change the loss they experienced. For the community of Wiley, the events of that summer became a permanent part of its history. For Candy Montgomery, the case defined how many people would remember her name. A single day changed the direction of many lives. That is perhaps the most important reminder when examining any true crime story. Behind every investigation are real people. Behind every courtroom argument are real consequences. Behind every headline is a human tragedy. The continued interest in the case eventually led to books, documentaries, and television dramatizations. These productions introduced the story to audiences who had not followed the original trial, ensuring that the events of 1980 remained part of popular culture. But the lasting significance of the case is not only found in its dramatic elements, it is found in the difficult questions it raises. The case asks how well people truly know those around them. It asks how hidden decisions can affect many lives. It asks how justice should operate when evidence provides some answers, but not all of them. It asks how society should understand self-defense when the person who could challenge that claim is no longer alive. These questions continue because they reflect broader issues that extend beyond one courtroom and one community. The story of Betty Gore and Candy Montgomery is ultimately a story about uncertainty. It is about the limits of what can be proven. It is about the difference between legal judgment and personal belief. It is about the challenge of understanding a moment that changed everything for everyone involved. More than 40 years later, the case remains one of Texas's most controversial homicide cases because it refuses to fit into a simple explanation. It is not only a story of violence. It is not only a story of betrayal. It is not only a story of a trial. It is a story about people, choices, consequences, and the search for truth. And at the center of that story remains Betty Gore. Before the investigation, before the headlines, before the courtroom debates, she was a person with a family, a profession, and a place in her community. Remembering that fact is essential. Because while the legal questions surrounding the case may continue to be debated, the human cost of the tragedy remains undeniable. A life was lost. A family was changed forever. A community was shaken. And a case that began with an ordinary visit between two people became a story that continues to challenge the way we think about justice, responsibility, and the difficult search for answers when the complete truth may never be fully known.